The soft fabric of the anniversary dress slipped between her fingers as she pulled it out from the back of the closet. It was the same dress she had worn on their honeymoon night, the one he said made her look like the woman of his dreams. She stood in front of the mirror, slipping it over her body, and reality hit hard. The zipper wouldn't go up. Her breathing slowed, heart pounding, cheeks burning. She turned to ask for help, smiling nervously. But he just stared, unimpressed, and scoffed. That dress isn't the problem. Maybe if you didn't eat like you're preparing for hibernation, it would still fit. His voice was dry, sarcastic. She felt the words slam into her chest harder than she expected. Her hands dropped, the zipper half up, the dream shattered. Later that evening, the table was set with candles and wine, the same meal they once shared as newlyweds. She tried to recreate the mood, to bring back the warmth. But he barely looked up from his phone. When she mentioned her idea for a weekend retreat, he laughed. "Why would I want to be seen with you at a resort? People might think I'm dating someone's mother." He chuckled, sipping his wine, not even noticing the way her eyes glistened. The meal grew cold, untouched. She excused herself, blaming a headache. But in the bathroom, with the door locked, she stood silently, gripping the edges of the sink, the flickering light above trembling just like her hands. In public, it was even worse. At a dinner with colleagues, she made a joke, something light to ease the silence at the table. He rolled his eyes and interrupted, "She's cute, right? Always trying. Don't worry, she's harmless." The others laughed politely, unsure. She laughed too, but it was hollow. On the way home, she asked him quietly why he said that. He shrugged. "You take things too seriously. It's just banter. If you can't handle it, maybe don't talk so much." That night, she lay wide awake next to a man who no longer saw her, in a bed that felt more like a witness than a sanctuary. Her friends noticed her silence before she did. They used to meet every Friday, but now she declined, saying she was tired, or busy, or something vague that even she didn't believe. In truth, she didn't want to show up and have to explain why she looked so weary, why she flinched when someone commented on her looks. Once, a friend asked if everything was okay at home. She smiled, too quickly. "Of course. Just life. Just getting older." But her friend didn't push. She appreciated that. What she didn't appreciate was how quickly she had learned to hide. How easily she had adapted to not being enough. When their anniversary came again, she tried one last time. A new dress this time, simple, flattering, safe. She booked a reservation at a restaurant they used to love. He arrived late, barely glanced at her, and sat down with a sigh. Halfway through the meal, he looked at her and said, "You're not the woman I married." She blinked. "No," she said slowly. "I'm not." His fork paused midair. "What does that mean?" She shook her head, her voice low but steady. "It means I've been trying to be her for so long, I forgot how to be myself." He didn't respond. When they got home, the papers were waiting on the kitchen counter. He had already signed them. She stared at the divorce papers under the kitchen light, the ink still fresh, the edges of the pages too sharp in her trembling hands. He didn't even wait for a conversation, a discussion, an argument, just left them there as if he was discarding a receipt. Her name was spelled out in full on every page, but it felt foreign, like she was reading about a stranger. She sat down at the table, the same one where they used to laugh over wine and silly arguments about takeout orders, and now, silence filled the room like dust, settling into every corner of her life. He returned from the shower with his hair wet and a gym bag slung over his shoulder. "You don't have to sign them tonight," he said flatly, not even making eye contact. She looked up, her voice caught somewhere between fury and defeat. "Is there someone else?" He hesitated. "That's not the point." Which meant yes. She nodded slowly, not in understanding, but in acceptance of a reality that had already taken shape behind her back. As he left the apartment, she didn't cry. Not yet. She just sat still, listening to the soft click of the door, the sound of her marriage ending. Packing was easier than she thought it would be. Most of what she owned was shoved into 3 suitcases and 2 cardboard boxes, all labeled with her neat handwriting. She took only the essentials, clothes, a few photo albums, and the sketchbook she hadn't touched in years. The apartment looked too bright once her things were gone, sterile, like a showroom. As she stood in the doorway one last time, she glanced back at the walls that had held her laughter, her sorrow, and her silent battles. "Goodbye," she whispered, not to him, not even to the home, but to the version of herself who stayed too long. Her new place was small, the kind of studio apartment that echoed when she walked. The roof leaked near the window, and the radiator made odd groaning noises during the night. But it was hers. There were no cruel remarks, no eyes silently measuring her body, no tension hiding behind drawn smiles. She bought new plates, white ones with blue edges, and cooked herself dinner for the first time in months. The silence was lonely, but honest. She sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker through the drizzle, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that finally stayed warm long enough to drink. She avoided mirrors at first. In the bathroom, she'd brush her teeth with her eyes fixed on the sink. But one morning, after waking from a restless sleep, she stood in front of her reflection and didn't look away. Her face was tired, softer in places, and her eyes held something she didn't quite recognize, something between sorrow and resilience. She didn't touch the glass, didn't say anything to herself, just looked. Minutes passed. Then she whispered, "You're still here." Her voice cracked a little. She didn't expect that to be the beginning, but something deep inside her shifted. And that was enough. She walked past the community center 3 times before finally stepping inside. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and lemon polish, and distant music echoed from a studio down the corridor. She hadn't danced in years, not since college, not since she was a different woman with different dreams. A paper flyer on a bulletin board had mentioned beginner salsa classes, no partner needed. Her hands were sweating as she signed the waiver. Doubt gnawed at her, but something stronger pulled her forward. She didn't know what she hoped to find in that room. Maybe grace. Maybe herself. The first class was awkward. She moved stiffly, painfully aware of every extra inch on her frame. The instructor, a man with kind eyes and an effortless rhythm, clapped his hands gently when she missed a beat. "Dance isn't about perfection," he said. "It's about presence." The music was loud, vibrant, nothing like the silence she had known for so long. As she stumbled through the steps, something stirred, a flicker of joy, a breath of freedom. The other dancers didn't stare. They smiled, laughed, encouraged. And she, for the first time in years, didn't feel invisible. After class, she sat on a bench outside, her shoes in her hands, feet aching but heart unexpectedly light. The street was quiet, the night air cool against her flushed skin. She tilted her head back and watched the clouds drift across the moon. She hadn't danced well, not even close, but she had danced. And tomorrow, she would return. Not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because it felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been buried under years of disapproval and neglect. For once, she wasn't doing something to be liked, she was doing it to live. Later that week, she noticed a yoga class in the room next to the dance studio. The low hum of soft music and the scent of incense wafted out every time the door opened. She peeked in and saw people of all ages and sizes stretching in silence. On impulse, she signed up. The first time she laid down on the mat, her mind buzzed with doubt and self-judgment. But as the instructor guided them into deep breathing, her thoughts began to slow. There was no competition here, no comparison, just breath, body, and stillness. Her heart, long held hostage by stress and criticism, began to soften. Each week, her body moved with a little more ease. Her posture straightened, her steps grew lighter. She no longer wore loose, dark clothes to disappear into the background. She chose color, even if it still scared her. In a small cafe near the studio, she met a woman after class who complimented her earrings, and soon they were sharing stories over herbal tea. The woman had gone through a messy divorce too, and their laughter came easy, healing. They exchanged numbers. It wasn't just her body transforming. Her world was opening again. And she wasn't afraid this time. On a quiet Sunday morning, she laced up her shoes and walked to the park. The air was crisp, the path still damp from the early rain. She hadn't run since high school, but something inside urged her forward. The first few strides felt foreign, her muscles protesting every movement. But she kept going, not for speed or distance, just to feel her breath against the rhythm of her feet. Her mind, usually crowded with noise, began to empty. The world narrowed to the sound of gravel beneath her and the steady thump of her heartbeat. It wasn't graceful, but it was hers. By the end of the week, her morning runs became routine. She no longer needed to convince herself to go. Her body started asking for it, craving the motion, the peace. On one of those mornings, a man walking his dog smiled and nodded as they crossed paths. "You've been out here a lot lately," he said casually. She smiled back, surprised by how good it felt to be noticed without judgment. "Yeah, I guess I have," she replied. There was no flirtation, no pretense, just two people acknowledging the effort of showing up. And in that small moment, she felt her sense of self solidify. One afternoon, she stood in front of her mirror, turning slowly in a dress she hadn't worn in years. It wasn't about fitting into something again, it was about seeing herself clearly. Her arms were stronger now, her face softer, more honest. There were still lines, stretch marks, imperfections, but she no longer saw them as failures. She saw a history etched into her skin, of pain survived, of strength reclaimed. She wore the dress not to impress anyone but to honor the woman who had kept moving when it would have been easier to give up. And as she left her apartment, she didn't shrink. She stood tall. She learned how to sew not for fashion, but for freedom. In the quiet hours of evening, she taught herself with online videos and second-hand fabric. Her fingers fumbled at first, pricking herself more than once, but eventually, her stitches grew confident. Each piece she made fit not a standard size but her shape, her taste, her voice. One evening, she completed a deep emerald dress with long sleeves and a gently flowing skirt. She tried it on, twirling slowly, watching how the fabric followed her. It was elegant, timeless, and entirely hers. No designer's name. No one else's vision. Just hers. A job posting caught her eye, a position at a local startup looking for someone with creativity and adaptability. She hesitated before applying, her resume modest, her last office job years ago. But she submitted it anyway, along with a carefully worded cover letter. When she got the call back, her hands shook with disbelief. The interview was scheduled for the following Monday. She spent the weekend preparing, rehearsing answers in the mirror, choosing an outfit that made her feel strong. When the day came, she walked into the room with a calm voice and a lifted chin. She wasn't the same woman who once apologized for taking up space. The office lobby buzzed with quiet conversation and the faint tapping of heels on tile. As she waited to be called in, she noticed her reflection in the glass wall, polished, steady, composed. When her name was called, she stood without hesitation. The interview panel greeted her warmly, but she could sense the usual assumptions behind their smiles. Still, she held her ground. She spoke with clarity, confidence, and just enough vulnerability to reveal her resilience. When asked about her gap in employment, she didn't shrink. "Life redirected me for a while," she said, "but I used that time to rebuild not just my skills, but my sense of self." The call came 2 days later, just before noon. She almost didn't answer, assuming it was spam. But the voice on the other end was cheerful, professional. "We'd like to offer you the position. Your energy is exactly what we're looking for." She nearly dropped the phone. Thanking them, she hung up and stood in stunned silence. Then, slowly, her face lit up. She didn't cry. She smiled, the kind of smile that comes from deep within, where healing lives. She danced barefoot around her apartment, laughing softly to herself. This wasn't just a new job. It was a new beginning, on her terms. A month into the job, she was invited to a networking gala hosted by one of the firm's biggest partners. The event was formal, exclusive. Most of the staff were either anxious or excited. She was quiet. Not nervous, just thoughtful. She knew the kind of people who would be there. She'd been married to one. That night, she pulled out the emerald dress she had sewn, added a simple pair of heels, and stood before the mirror one last time. "You belong in every room," she whispered to herself. The ride to the hotel was silent, her heart steady as the city lights passed by. As she walked into the ballroom, the chandeliers sparkled like stars trapped in crystal. Music played softly from a quartet in the corner. People turned as she passed, not with ridicule, but with interest. She could feel it, admiration without pretense. Conversations paused. Glasses lowered. She kept walking, posture tall, face serene. Then, near the bar, she saw him. Her ex-husband. Same smirk, same posture. But something in his eyes shifted the moment he saw her. Confusion. Recognition. Disbelief. He took a step forward, mouth slightly open, but she had already turned away. She wasn't there for him. Not anymore. Later in the evening, as she chatted with a potential client, he approached. "Excuse me, I'm sorry, do I know you?" he asked, brows furrowed. She turned slowly, her voice calm, amused. "You did," she said. He blinked, piecing it together. "I didn't recognize you, you look different." She tilted her head slightly. "Yes. Healing tends to do that." He started to speak again, but she raised a hand gently. "Let's not ruin the evening. Enjoy your night." And with that, she turned back to her conversation. He stood there, stunned, watching the woman he once dismissed become unforgettable. He followed her with his eyes from across the ballroom, as if trying to anchor the version of her he once knew to the woman standing confidently beneath crystal light. She smiled easily, engaged in conversation with people he couldn't place. He used to mock her for being too quiet, too awkward. Now, her silence held weight, and her words drew attention. He nursed his drink, uneasy. The woman who once sought his approval now carried herself with the kind of dignity he never taught her to claim. Later, he caught her by the terrace, just as she was finishing a conversation with an older woman from the hosting firm. "Can we talk?" he asked, voice low. She looked at him carefully. "About what?" He hesitated. "I didn't expect to see you here. You look incredible." She nodded, unimpressed. "And you expected me to vanish after you left me broken?" His mouth opened, then closed again. He wasn't ready for her composure. Not for the clarity in her gaze that no longer saw him as a loss. "I wasn't in a good place back then," he said finally. She didn't respond right away. "Neither was I. But the difference is, I didn't make you smaller to feel bigger." His face reddened. "I was selfish. I know that now. Seeing you tonight, it made me realize how much I lost." She studied him quietly. "I didn't change to impress you," she said. "I changed to reclaim myself." She turned to leave, pausing only to add, "Regret is a poor substitute for love." Then, without another word, she walked away. Inside the ballroom, someone handed her a glass of champagne. The music swelled, people began moving to the center of the room. She joined a group of colleagues on the edge of the dance floor, her laughter genuine, her body light. She no longer feared being seen, no longer apologized for taking space. As she swayed to the rhythm, her eyes scanned the crowd, not searching for anyone, just absorbing the beauty of the moment. Behind her, her ex stood watching, hands in his pockets, fully aware he was now a spectator in a life he once dismissed. She left the gala past midnight, heels in hand, coat draped over her arm. The city was quiet, the streets glistening with reflections of passing cars. She walked slowly, her body tired but her spirit vibrant. Back in her apartment, she placed the emerald dress gently over the back of a chair and looked at herself in the mirror. No makeup, hair slightly undone, eyes calm. This was the face of someone who had been shattered and rebuilt, not into what others expected, but into something true. Something whole. She smiled, brushing a hand over her collarbone. "Welcome back," she whispered to herself. The morning after the gala, she woke earlier than usual. The city still slept beneath a soft gray sky. With a warm cup of coffee in hand, she sat at her table and let the silence settle. Her mind replayed the night before, not out of doubt, but quiet affirmation. The way he looked at her, the way he hesitated and searched for words. None of it shook her. For years she had dreamed of this encounter as a kind of closure. But now she understood, she owed him nothing. Her triumph was not in his regret, it was in her release. Over the next few days, his messages arrived. Long, meandering paragraphs full of guilt and compliments she had once begged to hear. He wrote of his disbelief, his longing, his realization of what he had lost. But now she could read each word without trembling. She no longer sought apology. His remorse came not from a changed heart, but from wounded pride. She read them once, quietly, then deleted them all. Not out of anger, but peace. Closure didn't need to be loud. Sometimes, it simply meant refusing to answer what once would have broken you. One afternoon, a colleague invited her to speak at a local conference on personal growth. The thought terrified her. She had never seen herself as someone who could inspire others. But something in her said yes. On the evening of the event, she stood on a small stage, hands cold, voice tight. Yet as she began to share her story, the woman she had been, the one she had become, she felt a wave of strength wash over her. The audience listened in silence, some with tears in their eyes. She realized then, her journey wasn't just survival, it was a blueprint for rising. Afterward, a young woman approached her, voice shaking. "I thought it was just me. I didn't think it was possible to come back from that kind of pain." They hugged quietly, and no more words were needed. That night, back in her apartment, she sat by the window and let herself cry, not from grief, but from a kind of joy only survivors understand. The kind of joy that comes when you finally feel proud of the woman staring back at you. Her strength wasn't in forgetting what happened, it was in remembering it without breaking. Weeks later, her manager called her into a meeting. A new international project had launched, and they wanted her to lead it. It meant moving abroad, working across cultures, stepping into a much bigger role. Years ago, she would have panicked, doubted herself, made excuses. But now she saw the offer for what it was, proof that she was capable, ready, chosen. She accepted. At her farewell party, her co-workers surprised her with a heartfelt celebration. She stood among them smiling, knowing she wasn't escaping her past. She was running, full speed, into her future. Her flight was scheduled for early morning, the city still cloaked in darkness as she zipped up her final suitcase. She looked around the apartment one last time, taking in the quiet corners where she had rebuilt her life piece by piece. Every lamp, every chair, every detail was a reflection of her growth. She paused at the windowsill where she had once sat crying into tea, unsure if she would ever feel whole again. Now, she smiled. Wholeness didn't mean never breaking, it meant knowing how to gather yourself afterward. And now, it was time to go. Not to escape, but to expand. The new country welcomed her with a chill in the air and unfamiliar streets full of rhythm and life. The apartment they had arranged for her was modest but bright, with tall windows and warm wood floors. As she unpacked, she felt no fear, just anticipation. Her team was diverse, talented, and curious about her leadership style. They asked questions she once would have shrunk from, but now answered with clarity. With each meeting, each challenge, her confidence grew. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was creating, guiding, and setting a tone of empathy and strength. She was becoming a leader not just by title, but by presence. One evening, she received a message from someone she hadn't heard from in years, her former mother-in-law. The message was short but thoughtful, saying she had heard about her recent success and felt compelled to reach out. "He's not the same since you left," it said. "But I see now, maybe it wasn't you that changed. Maybe it was us who never really saw you." She read the words twice, then let out a long breath. There was a time those words might have unraveled her, stirred old wounds. But now, they simply confirmed what she already knew: growth speaks loudest in silence. Spring arrived with soft breezes and blossoms blooming along the cobbled streets near her office. She spent her weekends exploring markets, reading in cafes, and taking long walks through neighborhoods that slowly began to feel like home. Occasionally, someone would ask about her past, her story, and she would share pieces, enough to connect, but never to dwell. The past had shaped her, yes, but it didn't define her. What defined her now was presence, compassion, purpose. She had become the kind of woman she once thought only existed in books or movies, strong not in spite of what she endured, but because of it. On the anniversary of the day she signed the divorce papers, she lit a candle, not in mourning, but in celebration. She wrote herself a letter, sealing it in an envelope to be opened a year later. In it, she described her courage, her laughter, her tears, her dreams. She thanked herself for not giving up, for choosing healing over bitterness, for believing she was worth rebuilding. Then she took a long walk by the river, the evening light golden on the water. She stood quietly, breathing in the moment, the journey, the life she had claimed as her own. And for the first time, there was no ache. Only peace.